I want you to close your eyes for a second. We're going to do a little time travel. Imagine a traveler arriving in Bengal in the 17th century.
Okay.
This is a French physician and traveler, a man named François Bernier. He steps off a boat, he looks around, and he's absolutely stunned. He sits down to write a letter home, and he describes this place, Bengal, as richer than Egypt.
Richer than Egypt. That's a huge statement for that time. Egypt was the benchmark for wealth.
It really was. He sees a land that is literally overflowing with abundance. I'm talking cotton, silk, rice, sugar, butter. He even calls it a sink of the world's bullion.
That is such a powerful image, a sink of bullion. It implies that, gold and silver are flowing into the country from every corner of the globe in exchange for Indian goods, but
Right.
but that wealth never leaves. It just accumulates there.
It just sits there. It was a manufacturing powerhouse, a global economic magnet now.
Yeah.
Open your eyes. Flash forward about 250 years. It is August 15, 1947.
Right.
The British are finally leaving. The Union Jack is coming down from the Red Fort. And what is left behind? It's not a sink of bullion anymore.
No, far from it.
It's a country riddled with abject poverty, stagnation, and rampant disease. The manufacturing powerhouse is gone, replaced by a hollowed-out supplier of raw materials. So the question we are asking today is simple, but the answer is, well, it's devastating. How did we get from there to here?
How does that happen?
How does a country go from being the richer than Egypt benchmark to an economy on the brink of total collapse?
And that transformation, or maybe we should call it a degradation, is exactly what we need to unpack today. Because you really cannot understand modern India. You can't understand a single economic policy written after 1947 from the Planning Commission to the 1991 reforms unless you understand the wreckage that was left behind.
You have to know the starting point.
You have to understand the starting line to appreciate the race. It's that simple.
And that is our mission today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are taking a stack of sources, specifically the foundational text, NCERT Class 11 Economics, Unit 1, Chapter 1, and we are extracting the most critical nuggets of knowledge. This isn't just a history lesson.
No, it's much more than that.
This is the origin story of the Indian economy.
And specifically for our listeners who are tuning in from the Simplified UPSC by PPP community, this is your comprehensive audio summary. We aren't just skimming the surface. We're going line by line through Indian economy on the eve of independence. We are going to deconstruct the colonial logic that, dismantled a subcontinent.
That's right. We're going to make this material stick. But before we get into the grim statistics and the colonial strategies, I do have a humble request for you. If you find value in what we're doing, if this helps you crack that exam or just understand your country's history better, please go over to the Simplified UPSC by PPP YouTube channel and hit subscribe.
It really does help.
It sounds small, but it helps us keep these deep dives coming.
And for those who are capable, consider supporting the work on Patreon. It takes a significant amount of resources to curate this high-utility content, and your support literally keeps the lights on. We have to give a massive shout-out to the existing supporters who make this possible.
Absolutely.
You are the backbone of this project, truly.
Yeah, you couldn't do it without you. Also, don't forget to like this episode and share your valuable comments. It really helps the algorithm get this to the people who need it. And one huge notification, if you're looking for the notes to go along with this, plus practice previous year questions. We call them PYQs. They are available for free.
For free on the public Telegram channel.
Yep. And for the serious learners who want everything organized, all the videos, detailed notes, extra PYQs, and model mains answers, there is a private Telegram library.
Which is a goldmine for organized study.
It really is. You can just DM on the public channel to get access to that. And especially if you are prepping for mains.
Definitely.
Okay, housekeeping done. Let's get into the meat of this. We are looking at the period ending in 1947. Almost 2 centuries of British rule. Expert. If you had to summarize the economic philosophy of the British Raj in one single brutal sentence, what would it be?
It's quite straightforward, actually, and the source material is very explicit about this. The economic policies of the colonial government were concerned with the protection and promotion of British economic interests, not the development of the Indian economy.
That's it. Full stop.
That is the core argument. If you understand that, everything else, the railways, the trade laws, the land taxes, it all falls into place. India wasn't a partner. India was a resource to be consumed.
So India was essentially a tool, a means to an end.
Exactly, a feeder mechanism. The entire subcontinent was, it was re-engineered to serve a small island thousands of miles away.
Let's look at the macro view first, section 1 of our deep dives, the low level of economic development. You mentioned British interests. How did that practically shape the economy? What does a feeder economy actually look like on the ground?
Well, the structure of production in India was fundamentally altered. Before the British, as you mentioned with Bernier, we were producing things to sell to the world. We had a diverse economy.
Yeah.
Textiles, handicrafts, spices, shipbuilding.
Right, high-value goods.
High-value goods. Under the Raj, that changed. We weren't producing things to sell for our own profit anymore. We were shifted into producing raw materials, cotton, jute, indigo, wool, to feed the factories in Leeds in Manchester.
So we provide the ingredients.
Correct. And conversely, we became a captive market for their finished products. They took our cotton, spun it into cloth in England, and then
Sold it back to us.
sold it right back to us.
It's a closed loop. We grow the cotton, send it to them at a low price, they spin it into a shirt, and sell it back to us at a profit.
Precisely. And the value added, the profit from the manufacturing process, which is where the real wealth is generated, stays in Britain. But here's where it gets tricky for historians and economists trying to analyze this period. We know this was happening, but the colonial government never sincerely attempted to estimate India's national or per capita income.
They didn't measure it.
No.
That seems odd. I mean, the British were famous for their bureaucracy, their record keeping. They loved paperwork. They had a form for everything. Why no GDP data?
Well, think about it. If you are systematically looting a place, do you really want to keep a meticulous public ledger of how much poorer the victim is getting?
That's a good point. It's bad PR.
It's terrible public relations, but also fundamentally it just wasn't their priority. Their priority was tax collection and revenue extraction, not development metrics. They measured what they took, not what was left behind.
We do have some numbers today. Who is doing the counting if the government wasn't?
Individual attempts were made. And this is a list of names that any serious student really needs to know. You have to look at the private detectives of Indian economics. You had Dadabhai Naoroji, the grand old man of India.
Of course.
He was one of the first to formulate the drain of wealth theory in his book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India.
A classic. Who else?
Then you had William Digby, Finlay Shiraz, R.C. Desai. These were intellectuals, economists, and administrators who were trying to piece together the puzzle.
It sounds like a hodgepodge of intellectuals trying to solve a crime scene without access to the official police files.
That is a great analogy. And because they were working individually, often with limited data and different methodologies, their results were sometimes conflicting or, inconsistent. However, there's one name that stands out in the academic literature. V.K.R.V. Rao.
V.K.R.V. Rao.
Go.
Okay, why is he the significant one?
His estimates during the colonial period are considered the most scientific and significant. He brought a level of statistical rigor to the process that the others hadn't quite managed. He tried to account for errors and gaps in the data. And even with his rigorous, somewhat conservative approach, the numbers were grim.
How grim are we talking? Give us the headline statistics for the first half of the 20th century.
Okay, so if you look at the period from 1900 to 1947, the growth of aggregate real output, so the total size of the economy, was growing at less than 2% per year.
2% growth for the whole country. That sounds low, but in a pre-modern economy, maybe that's okay.
It might be okay if the population was stable, but the population was growing. So when you factor in population growth to get per capita output, the amount of income per person, the growth was a meager 0.5% per year.
0.5%, 0.5. That's basically a rounding error. That's stagnation.
It is absolute stagnation. Think about what that feels like for a regular person. It means that your standard of living is not improving. Over a lifetime of work, you are essentially exactly where you started.
Yeah.
Your children will not be richer than you. In fact, one bad harvest, one monsoon failure, and you slide backward into destitution because you haven't built up any reserves. That 0.5% is the statistical definition of hopelessness.
That is a heavy thought. Standing still for 50 years while the rest of the world is industrializing.
Yeah.
Let's move to where most of those people were actually living. Section 2, the agricultural sector. Because to talk about the Indian economy in 1947 is essentially to talk about farming.
Right. And most people is not an exaggeration. We are talking about 85% of the population living in villages and deriving their livelihood directly or indirectly from agriculture.
85%. Today we talk about India being an agrarian economy, but back then it was overwhelming. It was the entire universe for the vast majority.
Yeah.
And yet the source material calls it a sector of stagnation and misery. That seems paradoxical.
It does, doesn't it?
If everyone is working in agriculture, shouldn't there be some focus on making it work? Shouldn't that be the engine of the country?
You would think so. But despite that massive labor force, the sector was deteriorating. Agricultural productivity was incredibly low, and the root cause, the absolute villain of this story, if you will, was the land settlement system.
Okay, let's unpack this. The land settlement system. We hear about the Zamindari system a lot in history books.
Yeah.
How did this actually function to destroy productivity?
So the British introduced various systems of land revenue, but the Zamindari system, particularly in the Bengal presidency, which included modern-day West Bengal and practically all of Bangladesh, is the classic example of how to destroy an agricultural economy.
So how did it work mechanically?
The British government declared that they needed a fixed amount of revenue from the land, but they didn't want to go collect it from every single peasant. That's just too much administrative work. So they appointed intermediaries, the Zamindars. They told the Zamindars, you pay us X amount on this specific date. Anything you collect over and above that from the peasants is yours to keep.
So the Zamindar is basically a franchised tax collector. He has a quota to hit.
That's a great way to put it. But look at the incentives. The profit accruing out of agriculture went to the Zamindars, not the cultivators. The person doing the work saw none of the upside. But did the Zamindars invest that profit back into the land?
I'm guessing no.
Did they build irrigation canals? Did they buy better seeds or tools? No. They did nothing to improve the condition of agriculture. Their only interest was rent collection. They became rent seekers.
This extracted.
Just extracting. And the British made it a high-stakes game for the Zamindars, too. There was a system of fixed revenue dates, what was often called the Sunset Law.
The Sunset Law. That sounds dramatic.
It was. If a Zamindar failed to pay the British by sunset on the specific date, they lost their rights. They lost the Zamindari, it would be auctioned off to someone else.
So there's a chain of pressure. The British pressure the Zamindar with a threat of replacement and total ruin, so the Zamindar squeezes the peasant to the absolute limit to ensure he has the cash.
And the peasant has zero incentive to work harder or improve the land because any extra production just gets taken away as rent. And the Zamindar has no incentive to invest because he just wants cash now to pay the British and fund his own lifestyle.
It's a perfect recipe for stagnation.
It really is. No one involved has an incentive to improve the asset.
And this created immense misery. We have accounts of social tension, of peasants having absolutely no security of tenure. They could be evicted at any moment. But there's another layer to this agricultural mess, right? The commercialization aspect.
Yes. This is often misunderstood. Some people argue, but wait, agriculture did change. Farmers started growing cash crops. And it's true. There was a shift from food crops to cash crops like cotton, jute, and indigo.
Cash crops usually mean more money, though. If I'm growing indigo instead of rice and indigo sells for more, shouldn't I be richer?
In a free market, maybe? If you are an entrepreneur farmer making a choice, yes. But this was forced commercialization. Farmers were often forced to grow these crops to feed British industries indigo for dyeing textiles in England, jute for their factories. They were often given advances or loans that tied them to growing these crops at fixed low prices.
Well, they weren't growing it because it was the best option for them. They were growing it because the system demanded it.
Right. And here is the kicker. Even if they got a higher price for the cash crop, it didn't translate to wealth. Why? Because now they weren't growing their own food.
They had to buy it.
They had to buy food grains from the market. And since they were dependent on the market, they were vulnerable to price fluctuations. If the price of indigo dropped or the price of rice spiked, they starved.
They lost their food security. They lost their self-sufficiency.
Completely. They became exposed to global market forces without having the financial buffer to survive them. And we haven't even talked about the physical constraints yet.
The technology,
Oh,
or rather the lack of it.
Well, yeah. Low levels of technology, negligible use of fertilizers, and crucially, a total lack of irrigation facilities. Indian agriculture was entirely dependent on the monsoon.
Gambling with the rains.
Literally. If the rains failed, you had famine. If the rains were too heavy, you had floods. There was no terracing, no flood control, no drainage. The soil was suffering from desalination issues in some areas because of poor water management.
It was a sector starved of investment.
Starved, both from the government and from the private intermediaries.
So agriculture is a trap. It's a dead end. Let's look at the other engine of an economy, industry. This brings us to Section 3, the industrial sector. The sources use a very specific, very heavy phrase here, systematic de-industrialization. That sounds almost conspiratorial.
It wasn't a conspiracy, it was policy. Open, stated policy. Remember the intro? Bernier's sink of bullion. India was famous for its handicrafts, specifically the Dakai muslin.
Oh, the muslin. The stories about that are legendary. They called it Malmal. I've read that the finest variety was called Malmal Kaz, which implies it was fit for royalty. It's so fine you could pass a whole sari through a wedding ring, right?
That's the one. It was a symbol of high craftsmanship. It wasn't just cloth, it was art. And it enjoyed a worldwide market. Emperors in Rome and queens in Europe wanted Indian textiles. The British policy systematically wiped this out.
How? And more importantly, why? Why destroy an industry that is producing such high-value goods?
The why is twofold, and it goes back to that core colonial logic we established at the start. Motive number one. To reduce India to a mere exporter of raw materials, Britain had its Industrial Revolution. They had these massive machines in Manchester that were hungry for cotton.
Right.
They wanted India's raw cotton, cheap. If Indian weavers are using that cotton to make muslin, that's less cotton for Manchester.
Okay, so turn this into a farm. What's motive number two?
Motive number two. To turn India into a sprawling market for finished British products. Once you destroy the Indian handicraft spinner and weaver, where do Indians get their clothes?
They have to buy it from Britain.
Exactly. Manchester cloth floods the Indian market. It's cheaper because it's machine-made. It enters India duty-free, or with very low tariffs, while Indian goods face high tariffs in Britain. The Indian artisan, working by hand, simply can't compete on price.
So it's a pincer movement. You take our raw materials to make the stuff, and then you sell the stuff back to us, destroying our own ability to make it.
And the impact was devastating. It wasn't just an economic shift, it was a social catastrophe. It created massive unemployment. All those artisans, and we are talking about millions of people who had specialized skills passed down for generations, lost their livelihood.
Where did they go?
They had nowhere to go in the cities because there were no new factories. So where did they go? They went back to the village.
Back to the land.
They crowded into the already overcrowded agricultural sector, increasing the pressure on the land even more. This is what we call disguised unemployment. Too many people working on a plot of land that doesn't need them.
So, to be fair, in the second half of the 19th century, some modern industry did begin to take root.
Yeah.
It wasn't all a wasteland. We have to acknowledge the beginnings of modernization.
Yes, we must give credit where it is due, often to Indian resilience. Cotton textile mills came up. Interestingly, these were mainly dominated by Indian entrepreneurs.
That's a key distinction. The cotton mills were Indian-owned.
Mostly, yes. And they were located in the western parts of the country, Maharashtra and Gujarat. Think Ahmedabad, Bombay. This was the birth of the Indian capitalist class.
Makes sense. That's where the cotton grows, and that's where the mercantile communities were strong.
Then you had the jute mills. These were dominated by foreigners, mostly Scots and British, and they were concentrated in Bengal.
Because of the jute growing in the Ganges Delta.
Exactly. And then a major landmark, the iron and steel industry. TISCO, the Tata Iron and Steel Company.
1907. That's a date every student remembers. Jamshedpur.
A shining beacon, but a lonely one. It was a massive struggle for Jamsetji Tata to set that up against colonial indifference. A few other industries came up after World War II. Sugar, cement, paper. Largely because shipping from Britain was disrupted by the war, so they had to make things here.
Right. A necessity.
But there was a massive missing piece, the capital goods industry.
Explain that term for us, capital goods. It sounds technical, but why is it the backbone of an economy?
It is absolutely crucial. Capital goods are the machines that make other things. Machine tools, blast furnaces, heavy engineering. If you want to industrialize, you need to be able to build the factories. You need to build the looms, the lathes, the engines. India didn't have that.
So we couldn't build our own machines?
We wouldn't build the machines to build other things. So even if we had a textile mill in Bombay, the machinery inside it probably came from Britain.
Almost certainly.
So our industrialization was superficial. It was dependent on imports for its very existence. If Britain cut off the supply of spare parts, our industry would grind to a halt.
And the public sector, what was the government doing?
The government's role was strictly confined. They ran the railways, power generation, communications, ports.
Infrastructure, basically.
Only what was needed to facilitate colonial trade. They weren't building steel plants or chemical factories. So the contribution of this new industrial sector to the gross domestic product, the GDP, remained very, very small. It was a drop in the bucket compared to the massive agricultural sector.
So let's recap so far. Agriculture is stagnant and overcrowded. Traditional handicrafts are destroyed. Modern industry is tiny and dependent on foreign machinery. This leads naturally to Section 4, foreign trade. You called it the drain of wealth earlier. How did trade function as a drain?
This is one of the most important concepts to grasp. India has been a trading nation since ancient times. We were never isolated. But under the British, the composition and direction of trade changed completely.
Composition meaning what we traded, and direction meaning who we traded with.
Correct. On composition. As we discussed, we became a net exporter of primary products, raw silk, cotton, wool, sugar, indigo, jute, and we became an importer of finished consumer goods, cotton, silk, woolen clothes, light machinery produced in British factories.
The classic colonial pattern. We sell cheap raw materials, we buy expensive finished goods.
And then there's the monopoly control. Britain maintained a stranglehold on who we could trade with. More than 50% of India's trade was restricted to Britain.
50%. That gives them huge leverage on pricing. Who else were we allowed to trade with?
A few others, China, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, Persia, Iran. But Britain was the behemoth. And in 1869, something happened that tightened that grip significantly.
The opening of the Suez Canal.
The Suez Canal. This is a pivotal moment in geopolitical history. It cut through Egypt, connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. Before this, ships had to sail all the way around the tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, to get from London to Bombay.
That's a massive journey, dangerous and expensive.
The canal provided a direct route. It reduced transport costs and cut travel time drastically. But instead of benefiting the Indian trader, it just made it easier for Britain to flood the Indian market and extract raw materials faster.
So it just made the extraction more efficient?
Exactly. It intensified their control. Now, here is the part that always confuses people. The source says India had an export surplus.
Right, which sounds good. If I export more than I import, I have a positive trade balance. I should be making money. I should be rich.
In a normal economy, yes. If you sell more than you buy, gold and silver should flow into your country. You should be accumulating reserves. That's how Bernier saw the sink of bullion.
So why were we poor? Where did the money go?
It went to the drain of wealth. That surplus, the profit India made, did not come back to India. It was used by the British for 3 specific things.
Okay, let's list them. This is the mechanism of the theft.
1. To pay for the office expenses of the colonial government in Britain. The salaries, the pensions, the administrative costs of the India office in London were paid for by Indian exports.
So we were paying for our own occupation.
We were paying the salaries of the bureaucrats who were ruling us from London.
Okay.
Exactly. 2. To finance wars fought by the British, if the British Army was fighting in Africa or the Middle East to expand their empire, Indian money, and often Indian soldiers, was fueling that war.
Unbelievable. And 3.
The import of invisible items. This refers to services, banking, insurance, shipping. Britain charged India for these services, often at inflated rates. Since British companies owned the ships and the banks, the service fees flowed back to Britain.
So the gold didn't flow in, it just evaporated.
It was siphoned off.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the domestic market in India suffered. This is the tragedy of the export surplus. We were exporting grain while people here were hungry. We were exporting cotton while people here had no clothes.
So we had shortages at home.
There were shortages of essential commodities like kerosene and cloth in the domestic market because everything was being shipped out to generate that surplus to pay the British bills.
That is a devastating economic picture. It's extraction, pure and simple. And this economic reality must have had a social cost. You can't drain a country of its wealth for 2 centuries without breaking its people. Which brings us to Section 5, demographic conditions, the social reality.
You can't separate economics from people. The data here is, it's heartbreaking. First, the census. The first official census was in 1881. It revealed huge unevenness, but it gave us a baseline. But the real turning point is 1921.
The year of the Great Divide.
Yes. This is a crucial concept for demographics. Before 1921, India was in the first stage of demographic transition. This means high birth rate and high death rate.
So the population isn't growing much.
Right. People were dying as fast as they were being born due to famines and epidemics. After 1921, we entered the second stage. The death rate started to drop slightly, mainly because there were fewer massive famines due to better transport of food, not better health, but the birth rate remained high, so population started to grow.
Okay.
But looking at the social indicators, it was still a picture of misery.
Let's look at the numbers. Literacy.
Overall literacy was less than 16%.
16%. That means 84 out of 100 people could not read or write. They were locked out of the world of information.
And if you look at female literacy,
Yeah.
it was negligible, about 7%.
7%. That effectively cuts off half the population from participating fully in the modern economy or society. It reinforces patriarchy and poverty.
And then look at health. Public health facilities were either unavailable or highly inadequate. Water and airborne diseases were rampant. Malaria, cholera, plague, smallpox, these were constant killers.
The infant mortality rate, the IMR, is the statistic that always hits me hardest. It really measures the vulnerability of the most innocent.
It is the most sensitive indicator of a society's well-being. In 1947, the IMR was about 218 per thousand.
218. That means more than 1 in 5 babies died before their first birthday.
It's catastrophic. Contrast that with today. It's around 30 or 40 depending on the state. 218 means death is a constant presence in every family. And life expectancy. The average Indian could expect to live 44 years.
44 years. Today it's over 68. 44 years means you barely see your children grow up. You certainly don't get a long retirement. It changes the whole psychology of a society.
It forces you to focus on short-term survival, and it implies extensive poverty. We don't have precise poverty line data from back then like we do now, but the sheer visible reality of hunger and disease tells the story.
So we have a stagnant economy, a dying population. What were these people doing? We touched on it, but let's formalize it in Section 6. Occupational structure.
It was remarkably stable, which is a bad thing in this context. Stability here meant trapped. The occupational structure, the distribution of workers, showed little change, 70 to 75% in agriculture.
And the rest.
Only about 10% in manufacturing and 15–20% in services.
A modernizing economy typically sees a shift, right? People move from farms to factories.
Yeah.
That's the classic path, the Lewis turning point.
That is the standard path of development. India was denied that path. However, there were regional variations. This is important for our UPSC listeners. Nuance matters. It wasn't the same everywhere.
Where was the shift happening?
In the Madras presidency, which covered Tamil Nadu, Andhra, Kerala, Karnataka, and in Bombay and Bengal, there was actually a shift away from agriculture. Manufacturing and services were growing there.
Okay, so some pockets of urbanization and modernization.
Yes, these were the hubs of colonial administration and the few industries that existed. But this was counterbalanced, canceled out, really by states like Orissa, Rajasthan, and Punjab, where the workforce dependence on agriculture actually increased. So the national average remained stuck.
Now we have to talk about the elephant in the room. The one thing the British always point to as their great gift. Infrastructure.
Yeah.
Specifically, the railways.
Ah, yes. The modernizing mission. The British introduced the railways in India in 1850, and there is no denying it is considered their most important contribution.
It physically connected the country.
It did. It broke geographical and cultural barriers. People could travel long distances. It allowed the idea of India as a unified entity to take shape in a new way. It helped in the freedom struggle, ironically, by allowing leaders to travel and organize.
But I sense a massive but coming.
There is a big but. We have to look at the motive. The British didn't build trains so that an Indian family could go on a pilgrimage or visit their cousins. They built them to serve colonial interests.
Mobilizing the army and moving resources.
Exactly. The railways fostered the commercialization of agriculture we talked about earlier. It connected the remote village to the global market.
Which sounds good, but as we established, that commercialization destroyed village self-sufficiency.
It sucked the grain and raw materials out of the hinterland and brought them to the ports, Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, to be shipped to England. The benefits of this expanded trade rarely accrued to the common Indian person.
So it was an extraction network.
It was an extraction network, not just a transport network. It was a vacuum cleaner aimed at the Indian countryside.
And what about roads?
Same story. Roads were built primarily for mobilizing the army and drawing raw materials to the railway stations. There was an acute shortage of all-weather roads.
Meaning in the monsoon, the village is cut off.
Completely cut off, which is deadly during a famine or a medical emergency. They also tried inland waterways like the Coast Canal in Orissa, but it was often uneconomical and abandoned because they couldn't compete with the railways. The electric telegraph was introduced, expensive, but crucial for maintaining law and order.
Law and order meaning suppressing dissent.
Precisely. It allowed the viceroy to control the provinces from thousands of miles away.
So we have covered the landscape, from the farm to the factory to the train tracks. Now, I want to pivot to Section 7, linking to the bigger picture. This is specifically for our aspirants. We have these source clippings that show previous year questions, or PYQs.
This is where we separate the casual reader from the smart aspirant. You might think, okay, this is an economics chapter, I just need to know the GDP stats. But look at the PYQs provided in our source material.
I'm looking at them. Question 4 is about Indian rock-cut architecture. Badami Caves, Barabar Caves. Question 22 is about ecological succession in grasslands. Question 30 is about acid rain. Wait, why are these here? They seem totally unrelated to colonial economics.
Because the UPSC exam is interdisciplinary. When you study the colonial period, you can't just study the economy in a silo. For example, we talked about the railways. The railways needed coal to run the steam engines.
Right.
Where is coal found? The Chota-Nagpur Plateau. That links to geography. We talked about the Zamindari system in Bengal. That links to the political history of the permanent settlement of 1793. You need to know who Lord Cornwallis was.
Okay, that makes sense. But the rock-cut architecture.
Think about the timeline. The sources mention question 4 about Barabar caves from the Mauryan era and Badami from the Chalukyas. But then question 57 mentions Ajanta and Sanchi. As a student, you need to understand the contrast. The British period was about building functional, extractive infrastructure like railways and ports. The ancient period was about building cultural, spiritual infrastructure like caves and stupas. The British didn't build great monuments of culture, they built monuments of commerce.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. The intent of the builder is visible in the architecture.
And also, look at the environmental questions in the source e-waste, acid rain, question 29 and 30.
Yeah.
Connect that to the drain of wealth. In the colonial era, the drain was economic gold and silver leaving. Today, the drain or the burden is often environmental. We import e-waste, we suffer from acid rain due to industrialization, the pattern of exploitation or burden shifting changes forms. The exam expects you to have that holistic view.
So when you read commercialization of agriculture in the NCERT, you should also be thinking about monoculture, growing only one crop, and how that affects the soil ecosystem, which links to the ecology questions.
Exactly. Don't just memorize the text. Connect the text to the map, to the environment, and to the culture.
That is solid advice. Okay, we are nearing the end of our deep dive. Let's bring it all home. Let's synthesize this.
If we summarize the state of India in 1947, it's a pretty sobering list. 1. A stagnant agricultural sector saddled with surplus labor and the Zamindari burden.
2. A decimated handicraft industry with no modern industrial base to replace it.
3. Foreign trade that was rigged to drain wealth out of the country.
4. Infrastructure built for extraction, not connection.
And 5. A population that was illiterate, poor, and dying young.
The challenge for the new independent government was absolutely enormous. They weren't just building a nation, they were digging one out of a hole.
A very deep hole. Every policy they made, the 5-year plans, the focus on heavy industry under Nehru and Mahalanobis, the Green Revolution, was a direct response to this wreckage. You can't critique Nehruvian economics or the 1991 reforms without understanding the starting point.
Right.
They didn't have a blank slate, they had a broken slate.
Here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on, something that isn't explicitly in the text but jumps out from this discussion. We often hear that the railways were a gift from the British. But I want to use an analogy. If I break into your house and I build a hallway just so I can carry your furniture out to my truck more easily, is that hallway a gift? Or is it a mechanism of theft?
It's a powerful question. And how does that historical shadow still affect our logistics today? We are still using those same tracks. Are they aligned for our modern needs, connecting our cities to each other? Or are they still historically aligned for colonial extraction, connecting the hinterland to the ports?
It's worth thinking about.
It really is.
Absolutely. History isn't just in the past, it's in the infrastructure we use every day. Listen, if this deep dive helped you connect the dots, please do us a favor. Subscribe to Simplified UPSC by PPP on YouTube. It's a small click for you, but it means the world to us.
And if you can, support the Patreon. It allows us to keep digging deep. To all our supporters, thank you. You are the real MVPs.
Like, share, comment. Tell us what you thought about the drain of wealth. Do you agree with the hallway analogy? And remember, for the free notes and those PYQs we discussed, check the public Telegram channel.
And for the premium library with the organized content, DM us to join the private group. It's the best way to streamline your prep.
We'll be back with the next chapter, looking at how India started to rebuild from this ruin. Until then, keep learning.
Keep questioning.